Hello and good day, and welcome again to our class in Introduction to Literary Studies. This is the third meeting, and today we're going to discuss major genres, prose fiction. Excuse me. I already assigned you to read the second chapter of Mario Clara book, and the chapter is quite a bit long. It talks about a lot of genres. So for this first part, for this meeting, that is, we're going to talk mostly about the novels, that is the prose fiction. And for today, for this first part of the video, we're going to talk about the history and the general definition of genres before moving on to the next part of the video, which will talk about the elements of the novel genre. So let us start with the description about major genres in literature. Now, first thing off is that you need to know what genre is. Genre can be defined simply as a type, a category of literary works, or a class of it. You don't mention it like genre. That is not the correct pronunciation because this is a word derived from the French. So you say it like the French do, genre mostly. So there are three largest as most common genre. There is the first is the epic. This is we start from the classical, yeah. We're talking about more historical terms here. The first genre that is prominent during the earliest history of English literature are the epic, the poetry, and the drama. Drama means the performance. Yeah. So, and then as time goes by, during the 17th century, a more, what do you call it, a successor, a follow-up, so to say, to the epic verses are the novels and prose fiction in general. Now, as I said before, today we're going to focus only on the epic and the novels, prose fiction, because this is the most common, and the chapter starts with it. Now, what is actually prose fiction? Uh, Obviously, you know more about novels. I think it's quite a common word. However, prose fiction, we need to define first some of the attributes of prose fiction. Obviously, it is a literary works. Yes, it is a fiction. It's not news. It's not something you see on the newspaper, etc. This is strictly fiction, and it has a story, and it uses natural language. Perhaps this is the most important attribute: is that it is not written like a poem. It is not poetic. It does not use rhythm and stuff that are usually common to poetry. The term prose fiction is very wide. We call that umbrella terms. It covers many kinds of works, but usually the best examples, or the prototype, so to say, are the novels and short stories. So after getting that definition, yeah, let us continue with the history of this genre. Now, the first major genre uh, that we want to talk about is the epic. Epic here is a long poem that narrates a long story. The first epic of the English literature is Beowulf, if you ever heard of it. It is not made like what you would read in a novel, so it is written in a verse. Yes. It is seriously religious or spiritual and has a lot to do with national identity. So the scope is very important. It is religious. It is spiritual. Try to think of Uh, Perhaps a similar one would be mm, Pandawalimo or Ramayana epics. That it is written in a verse, in a poetic verse, and it deals with almost abstract heroes with very large and important issues. Cosmic is universe, yeah. Cosmos from the word cosmos means the world as we know it, and it deals with broad, universal, important issues. Like Ramayana is easily talks about your identity as a person, as a nation, and so is Beowulf. Beowulf deals with the founding of a kingdom. You know, it is narrative, kind of long poem. So it tells of a story. It is very long. The length is long. It has characters. Yeah, it has a plot. Plot is basically you can call a plot is a storyline, like what summarizes the events that happens in a literary work. That's basically what a plot is, and it is the ancestor of the modern novel or fiction. The novel and the fiction are relatively new inventions. They come up quite recently, of course, relatively, yeah. The English language as a separate language started to exist in the 7th until the 11th centuries. That is the year 600s until the around 600s to 1100s. So after the epic emerged as the earliest form of narrative uh, genre, the one that tells the story, we have a subset, a type of epics that also narrates a long story. It can be a verse, meaning written like a poem, or it can be a prose, which is written like the common everyday language that you talk about. So not in a rhythm, not in a poem, and it's more down to earth. If you consider the epic, it talks about serious religious spiritual with abstract heroes, perfect heroes. We are now talking about more down to earth issues, romance. Romance deals with love, and it's very human issues. Talking about dating and etc. right now, if you put it in a more present context, it talks about more human, that is to say, more real or weaker characters dealing with human issues. Talking about girls and such. Focused, it is more focused and more perspective-based storytelling. Now, when we talk about the epic, it talks about abstract heroes, very perfect heroes, and the point of view is the narrator, the teller, the one who is telling the story, knows everything. Now, the romance is more focused on a more perspective based. So it is not being told by someone who knows everything. It's just told from a certain perspective. So it has detailed characters and a unified point of view, not a general point of view. Like you see the stories of creations. Those are the good examples of epics, how the world is created, and it is told in a religious or a very spiritual point of view. It seems like the person who is telling it is non-existent. Like is a very general. It talks about the truth. The viewpoint is obviously non-human. However, romance, because it deals with human characters and love, it uses a certain point of view, what we call here as a unified point of view, usually uh, from a third person or a first person. This is also the ancestors of the modern novel or fiction. And then the last form of this genre, the more modern form, are the novel, which is a long prose. So if romance can be a verse, now novels are just prose. It is not does not take poetic form, does not sound and look like a poem. It still narrates a long story. And it is kind of like a romance, but it takes it at a full individualistic focus of characters. That is to say, individualized is more down to earth, more human, more to the individual person and their issues and their challenges and their stories. And it can take the seriousness down to the level of just being a parody or comedy for fun. Now, Epic talks about very serious religious, spiritual topic like creation of the world. The romance may talk about kings and queens. Novel may just be just for fun, just for the sake of telling to make a laugh, for example. Now, it pictures individual characters in a very realistic way. And you see in the novel, the speech is very common, it's not poetic. The characters are real, they have weaknesses, they have problems, and they deal with it. And it does not, by individualism, we also consider that it does not really care about telling a very moralistic, a very religious issue, unlike the epic, which is usually in English literature is medieval, so it has something to do with Christianity or spreading the word of God, of the Holy Book. It does not really, the novel does not really concern with telling you what to do with your religion or how the world is created. It just focuses on telling individual stories in a very realistic way. So it does not have a collective or community orientation, as it does not want to take, or it doesn't really, what you call that, address, it doesn't really try to tell you about a very collective or community orientation purposes, like creating the identity of a nation or telling the creation of the world. It's just about a good story, and that was it. Now, as I said before, this is just a summary. The orientation, if epic, deals about the community, what is more important about the community, it takes a very big responsibility, while the novel is more to the individual pleasure and individual perspective. And time period for epic is usually in the Middle Ages, dark to the Middle Ages, but usually the most common one are in the medievals in the 1200s, the year 1200s, while novel is actually a very new invention, and it came out only 300 years ago, which is, if you consider the emergence, the creation, so to say, of the English language is around the year 600, 700, up until the 1100, because we do not have a very a specific, what you call that, specific proof of it. The Old English was around for around the centuries. The findings of the stories or anything written in Old English is around the 6th to the 10th century. And that's just how far the history of England can be historically proven. We're not talking about ancient Egypt, which is in the BCs, or ancient China, or ancient Rome. We're talking about ancient England. So yeah, it exists for the epic exists for 900 years, while the novel existed only for the last 300 years. So novel is very modern in that sense, in that relative sense. The concern and the focus of epics are religious and spirituality, while novel is mundane. Mundane is just worldly, day to day. The opposite of spiritual is mundane, worldly, money, love, stuff like that. And it is based on a socio-historical context. The novel, therefore, has become realistic because of that. It takes a very socio-historical context instead of a timeless spirituality. And the development is also important. Epic is written by very, very highly renowned scholars or rulers, and they were written by monks. They were written by leaders of the community, and while novel is written by writers who are maybe just common people. Now this has something to do with the societal and technological changes. As we know, the publication of books used to be very expensive and very hard, and not very many people knows how to read and write. So that's why the epics in the first form is like the fruit of the creation of the highest kinds of people who are monks or priests or kings. While novel, because publication now can be very cheap, everyone can write a novel and everyone can read a novel. Therefore, it has become more popular because of the societal and technological changes. Now, let's us talk about the kinds of novels. That is to say, a genre within a genre. Now, the three major genres are the novels, poetry, and drama. But within novels, we find more categorization, more types of it. Picaresque is one person against the society, one person who is against everyone. Bildungsroman, it is a German word, meaning educational, coming of age kind of story. Think of the stuff that you usually on film that shows how a person who is a nobody then becomes a very, in the end, he becomes uh, a very important person. Usually, the character can be children or teenagers as well, and they overcome this great barrier and becoming a man, becoming, learning very important virtues and learning very important attitudes. In the beginning, this person is terrible, bad, or nobody, but in the end, he's the hero, he's the adult person, he is the capable person. Now, those are the examples of Bildungsroman. Epistolary, using letters as storytelling tool. This is usually in the 18th century, the 17th century. Like it's a collection of letters that are telling a story. Yes, not very common now, but usually the name of the novels, like Clarissa, and then stuff like that. Novels are usually the names of the person, so it's not very common now. Historical is implementing specific historical context. So it is kind of scientifically accurate, so to say. Tries to make a historical, what you call that, historical, artful interpretation of historical episodes. New Journalism is a novel that discuss or rework real events, quite similar to historical. Satirical is veiled criticism of society. A satirical works something like this. Now, if you want to criticize your current government, so to say, it is quite impossible for you to get away with that. The government will come to your house, to come knocking on your house, and a lot of people will be angry if you, for example, use the name of the president, the real name of the president, and start saying bad things about him and writing fiction about him that never happens. You can be up for some legal, what you call it, troubles. They can call you in front of the judge. However, if you make it somewhat satirical, like for example, instead of the name of the real president, you consider of retelling the president as the head of a factory, or even as the George Orwell's example of the farm. The owner of the farm is the leader of that country. So you're trying to blur, you're trying to cover their real identities by talking about a different one. Now, this kind of show is actually very famous after the 1998 in Indonesia. So instead of talking the real president, we're talking about the mock president, the false president of the republic that is non-existent. So you try to criticize the current and very real condition by using what do you call that, replacements in an artful form. So instead of talking the president, you're talking about the head of the RT, for example. Make him like the strongest uh, king in some faraway land that is non-existent. That way you can get the criticism across without making anybody angry, because you can always say that I'm not talking about the real president, I'm not talking about him, but you're still talking about the topic that is very current and very important without being very subjective and without having too many people angry at you because you're making fun of the current government. So that is a very simple definition of satirical. It's a veiled criticism of society. It can also, a satire can also be in the form of science fiction or utopian settings, like the George Orwell's Animal Farm. If you haven't read it, you can always uh, know more about it. 1984 is also a good satire, and also science fiction. You can always talk about the current problems of your society and try to say that this is the community of the future. For example, you want to criticize about how people not working to help each other. You want to create a setting in your novel, for example, that in the future there will be this giant robot who help everyone. And how this giant robot is very useful, and that's a way of you to criticize your current society because they are never being useful. Or you want to make that giant robot to be very unhelpful and it controls the society and people need to help each other. So you still get the topic going, the discussion going, but you don't hurt anybody in the process. Gothic novel is basically like dark and scary novels. Frankenstein is a very good example. Those old vampire novels, you know, the setting has to be dark. Uh, it's a bit horror, yes, but usually the most common images of a Gothic novel, is those castles, you know, and dark places. It can be about ghosts, stuff like that. And detective novel is the crime-fighting novels. Sir Conan Doyle and his what was it called? Sherlock Holmes. Yes, and also mm, that is the most famous example. It usually talks about who done it. So who done that crime and how? The latest iterations of these are those crime TV series like that CSI stuff. Those are the latest creation of the detective genre, the crime fighting genre of prose fiction. Now let's talk about the short stories. Short stories is first introduced in a frame story, a small tale within a larger story. Example here is the Canterbury Tales. So Canterbury Tales talks about uh, a whole bunch of pilgrims, you know, religious pilgrims, Christian pilgrims from England who are trying to get to important holy sites in England. And by telling that, it talks about personal tales of each of those pilgrims. So the frame story is that you got this whole bunch of guys who wanted to visit holy shrines, holy places. But in doing so, you also tell about the smaller stories of each one of them. There is a maid there. There is a woman who is doing something. There is a father who is telling about some of his own stories. So there you have a lot of smaller stories inside of bigger stories. The bigger story will be considered a frame story, the one that frame the small ones. Now, it exists also in the form of traditional tales, ancient myths, and fairy tales. Those are usually short and sweet. Uh, when you tell a traditional tales or ancient myth or fairy tales, you don't want to tell, uh, by your mouth, orally, uh, not in writing. You want to tell short and beautiful stories, and this developed the short story form as it is first developed alongside, almost on the same time, as the novel in the year 1700s, which is the 18th century. In England, it is developed more earlier in Spain, but in England it is in those years, 1 century after Spain, I think. Short story is short, episodic, and contained. Therefore, it has to be more suggestive. If you watch a lot of Netflix, if you watch a lot of those TV series, you know that they always have a hanging end, that hooks you to the next series. So there's a good example of the what you call that example, more modern example of short stories that they have to be contained, but they are episodic. They're suggestive, more bombastic, if that word help you. And while short stories are short, episodic, and contained and suggestive, there are more shorter version of the novels, which is the novella and novelettes. So they may have less chapters than a common novel. Well, a common novel can reach up to 300 pages, for example. A novella can be like 3 chapters in like 90 pages or novelettes. So they're trying to go in between the short stories and the novel. And I think that's all for this first part of my explanation. Next, we will move on to the elements that this particular genre, the novels or the prose fictions, have. So, yes, thank you.